Hello, welcome to this discussion of Sartre's Preface to The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon. I want to use this video as a sort of general introduction to Fanon and also to extend the discussion of the anti-colonial politics of existentialism. It's clear, as we'll see when we look at Black Skin, White Masks, that Sartre is very influential on Fanon, but the influence goes both ways, and Fanon clearly becomes an important figure for existentialism generally. His adaptation of the psychological model that existentialism sketches is innovative in certain important ways. It doesn't just adapt, I think, uncritically Sartre or Beauvoir's views. I think it innovates in certain areas and responds critically. We'll see some critical remarks that Fanon makes of Sartre in Black Skin, White Masks. But I also think it's important to see how Sartre views his role as a public intellectual to be a kind of gateway and advocate for voices from North Africa. He also prefaces works by Albert Memmi and other sort of anti-colonial writers, and I think part of this is an amplification process. Sartre, by 1960, 61, 63, when he is really writing a lot of these things, is a huge public figure and intellectual in France, and it's very difficult to overstate the power of Sartre's pen in French letters and French media. And so here I think you can see Sartre both using his position to amplify and attempt to justify, in the eyes of a particularly white French audience, the works by Black North Africans and people from the colonies generally. I think you can also see Fanon's book provides Sartre with an opportunity to more vocally and strongly condemn France for its colonial politics. So there's like a two-way benefit here. On the one hand, Sartre's huge platform serves as a promotional tool for Fanon, while at the same time Fanon provides Sartre with a opportunity to voice his own condemnation. So there's kind of a two-way. Again, just like the influence goes in both directions, I think the political opportunity also cuts both ways here. Sartre was very controversial in his defense of these kinds of works and these kinds of arguments, particularly because Sartre defends and Fanon argues in favor of the use of political violence in the revolutionary activity of groups like the FLN, and really in any sort of liberation movement that seeks to free the colonized from the colony. And Sartre himself was targeted. He was bombed by his apartment was bombed twice by French nationalists at this time in the early 60s. So he was viewed to be a threat to the French establishment by at least some figures on the French right in support of colonialism. You can also see in his preface to The Wretched of the Earth the profound impact of Marxism on Sartre's thinking, as he phrases this as a kind of a dialectic. So the version that I am going to be referencing here and that I'll be quoting from can be found in the Colonialism and Neocolonialism text. Of course, the preface is also contained in this edition of The Wretched of the Earth. For anyone who's interested, I recommend just buying Wretched of the Earth. And it has some interesting foreword by Homi Bhabha, and as well as Sartre's preface. So there's some good material augmenting Fanon's text, which of course Wretched of the Earth is itself should be read pretty widely. But again, for these videos, I'm going to be referencing the translation found in this Colonialism and Neocolonialism book. If you remember our discussion of Sartre's Colonialism as a System, at the very end of that essay, Sartre begins to sketch out this idea that colonialism is destroying France as well. He says in that text, Colonialism as a System, meanwhile, mainland France is caught in the trap of colonialism. As long as she asserts her sovereignty over Algeria, she is compromised by the system, that is to say, by the colonists who repudiate her institutions, and colonialism obliges France to send democratic Frenchmen to their deaths to protect the tyranny that an anti-democratic colonialists exert over the Algerians. But here, once again, the trap works and the circle tightens. The repression that we exert for their benefit makes them each day more detestable. To the same degree that they protect them, our troops increase the danger they are in, making the presence of the army all the more indispensable. So it's a reinforcing, again, as he had said earlier in that same essay, the system becomes reinforcing. The more violent the repression of the Algerian liberation movement, the more the army presence is needed as the violence sort of ramps up and ramps up and ramps up. And the cost of the war. So he says we are reaching the point where the system destroys itself. The colonies are costing more than they bring in. In his preface to Wretched of the Earth, Sartre is going to pick up on this theme and frame it as a dialectic, that the French colonial system created a situation in which its antithesis will emerge, and the tension of this contradiction within the system will lead to its destruction. So he will start to talk in the preface to The Wretched of the Earth in much more explicitly Marxist terms as a dialectic. Now, it's not a dialectic that will necessarily resolve itself in a neat synthesis where the parts are all integrated. So I think here you'll see Sartre making some of his own claims in advancing his own understanding of the dialectic, which again he will work out at length, many, many pages in the massive 2-volume work, which is ultimately sort of unfinished. The Critique of Dialectical Reason. The other thing that the preface of Wretched of the Earth does is that it addresses itself to white readers, to French readership, but takes some pains to impress upon readers that Fanon's text is not written for them. So Sartre uses the opportunity to deploy like a decentering rhetoric where he wants to emphasize to a white audience that the book that they're reading, which he encourages them to read and he thinks people should read, is not for them. So they shouldn't be surprised when they find that it speaks about them, but not to them, and that they are made to feel a certain way about what Fanon says, feelings of guilt, particularly feelings of shame and other things like that. Now, I think sometimes this element of Sartre's analysis gets a bit overemphasized. I've read recently articles by, for instance, Judith Butler, and a commentary on Butler's interpretation by Kate Mann, that really emphasizes this role of like white melancholy or white shame in Sartre's text. That I think is a bit overemphasized because the text is not really about white guilt. Sartre recognizes that these feelings will emerge, and he seems to be arguing that they are earned, that there is a sense in which people should feel some shame and guilt for their complicity in the system. But I think such an interpretation cuts back against Sartre's decentering rhetoric. To frame it as being sort of about white guilt or white shame recenters white feelings and sentiment in the text that Sartre is acknowledging isn't really about us. So while that decentering move might make us feel a certain way, ultimately neither the preface nor the text Wretched of the Earth is really about that. I think that's a pretty selective and narrow reading of what the preface is doing. So that's my 2 cents on a reading of the Sartre's preface that would center something like white guilt or melancholy or something like that. Also, I think that if you're reading the actual preface to Wretched of the Earth, the tone of the piece is certainly not melancholy. There's a lot of anger in the text. Sartre uses expletives in the text. He breaks from a very formal academic analysis to speak more stridently and polemically about certain things. So I don't get a sense of melancholy from the text so much as a call for action. One of the reasons why Sartre is drawing attention to Fanon is because Fanon is making arguments for direct action in politics. I mean, he's not asking us just to sit on our laurels or go out and vote in other people who are going to do, no. He's talking about a much more direct engagement and leveraging on-the-ground political power and clout outside of the regular avenues. We've already seen Sartre himself in Colonialism as a System argue that reform, using the levers of power already established within the colonial system, is not going to get anywhere. So that's the sort of final arguments made in Colonialism as a System, is that reforms don't work for a variety of reasons, because the system can't be overturned from within. You're not going to find the tools to dismantle the system within the system. This is something I think echoes with Audre Lorde's very famous short essay, "The Master's Tools Will Not Dismantle the Master's House." So you can't sort of play by the rules of the power structure and expect the power structure to cede to you the things that you want. Your demands will always be compromised and watered down and twisted to work for the benefit of the system, whose ends are determined by the interests of the powerful and the interest of foreign national sovereignty in the case of France and Algeria, and so on. So those are all things I think that are really important to foreground going into Sartre's preface here. At the very beginning, he mentions that the population of the Earth is divided into 500 million human beings and 1,500 million natives, so a billion natives, so-called natives. And we'll see the work that Fanon does with this term, native, as a class created exactly by the colonized and so on. The former, so the human beings, possessed the word, the rest borrowed it. Between the former and the latter, corrupt kinglets, feudal landowners, and artificially created false bourgeoisie served as intermediaries. In the colonies, the naked truth revealed itself. The mother countries were for to dress. They needed the natives to love them, like mothers in a way. The European elite set about fabricating a native elite. They selected adolescents, marked on their foreheads with a branding iron the principles of Western culture, stuffed into their mouths verbal gags, grand, turgid words which stuck to their teeth. After a brief stay in the mother country, they were sent back, interfered with. Fanon will draw attention to this use of language in the beginning chapter of Black Skin, White Masks, and the effect of education as a distancing mechanism on people who leave their home place to go be educated by Western countries, and the way that they return with a new language that places them in a social rung above their country bumpkins is a way that Fanon talks about it. So the seeds of discord within the colony are being sown by, again, the mother country itself, sort of at every stage of progress. The initial antagonism is set up by the colonial system, and then the contradictions start to multiply throughout the whole system as different segments of the population become split up in a way and set against each other and set against their own interest, because again, the interest of the colony has to always serve the interest of the colonizer. So France's interest has to be served over the interest of Algerians or Tunisians or Martinicans or whatever the case may be. Whenever you look at it, the trauma and the distance that's generated between people in the colony is exacerbated from generation to generation. So there's an idea that if you better yourself, quote unquote, through Western education, then you'll become closer to leaving the category of the native and entering into the category of human being. And again, Fanon is going to stress this in Black Skin, White Masks, that that's the white mask part of it, that to try to improve yourself under this system means to try to become white and adopt the language and culture of whiteness and Western European culture and history and literature and all of that kind of stuff. And language is a primary scene of this. And again, we'll see that stressed in Black Skin, White Masks. But over time, the sort of reality starts to sink in that the full status is not going to be conferred, that no matter how hard one works or how hard one tries, you're never gonna make it out of the native status. So you have Sartre sort of talking about the intergenerational disturbance that arises out of this process. Another generation came which shifted the argument. With incredible patience, its writers and poets tried to explain to us that our values were poorly suited to the reality of their lives, that they could neither entirely reject them nor assimilate them. By and large, that meant, you are making monsters of us. Your humanism claims that we are universal, but your racist practices sets us apart. And this is one of the key contradictions that Sartre will latch onto, that Western liberalism pretends to a universalism while in practice inscribing in the world hard racial lines that exclude huge numbers of people from the category of human being, where human being means white. And if you're not white, then you're not going to be included in the category of human being from the perspective of the wielders of power, which happen to have their origin in Europe, in the colonial system. And so, of course, this becomes an ontological distinction made by Europe, that you belong to one set or one kind of being, or you do not. Another good place to look for this analysis is in Charles Mill, Blackness Visible, Dark Ontology, those kinds of concepts. The concept of a dark ontology is, I think, particularly good analysis of this kind of dynamic that gets played out. And you get basically tokenization, the awarding of prizes. Certain individuals, again, are selected, as he's already indicated, and elevated into positions of prominence. So he talks about awarding a black person the Prix Goncourt. It's one of France's top, perhaps the top literary prize in France, right? Goes to then a black person. And so, oh, look, we've made it. And again, you can still see this kind of tokenization when we become obsessed, and I think that the liberal tendency to become obsessed with firsts, the first black woman to win this award, the first black astronaut, the first black president, those sorts of things become points of obsession for liberal politics, where they can hold up one example of an individual and say, oh, see, things are getting better because this one person has made it without addressing the system that keeps the vast majority of people marginalized and far, far from the offices of the presidency and from other kinds of things like that, right? So this is part of what Sartre and Fanon and Beauvoir will analyze under the idea of mystification. If you think that holding up one or two successful black people means that the system of racism has been dismantled because it's allowed one or two to rise to positions of prominence, then you've basically been mystified, because under that mystification, you're not able to see the systematic problem that's marginalizing huge swaths of people, because you become hyper-focused on the individual that has only been allowed to rise through the sort of charity of the system that has selected them. And it's selected them in part because they're friendly to the ends of the system. They've decided to play ball. And if they weren't playing ball, the system wouldn't have allowed them to reach the prominence that they would have said, no, you're not going to be, you have to be one of the good ones, so to speak, if we're going to allow you to stand out and be hyped as a kind of model or something to that effect, right? So once we get to 61 with the Algerian War on, Sartre starts to say, listen, in 1961, let us not waste time on sterile litanies or on nauseating mimicry. Let us quit this Europe, which talks incessantly about man while massacring him wherever it meets him, on every corner of his own streets, in every corner of the world. For centuries, in the name of supposed spiritual adventure, it has been suffocating almost the whole of humanity. This tone is new. Who dares to adopt it? An African, a man of the third world, a former colonial subject. He adds, Europe has reached such a mad and uncontrollable speed that it is heading toward an abyss from which it would be better to move away. In other words, it has had it. So from one generation, you have people thinking they can basically get a seat at the table, and a few are selected to take up a seat, tokenized at the table. But eventually the masses of people are going to be like, you know what, we don't even really want a part of this anymore. You haven't really, all of your promises of, culture and civilization have been hollow. They've been made solely to advance your own interests. And so screw your table. We don't really want any part of this anymore. Let us quit Europe and get away from it. Hence these sort of liberation movements that seeks to kick the Europeans out. This is a big point of controversy in the position of Sartre and Beauvoir and people who are thinking like them, because they're basically saying there needs to be a separation, and France needs to leave and the French need to leave Algeria, and there's no place for France there. And of course, again, I have mentioned it before, but someone like Camus, who's born in Algeria and is what is called a pied noir, are going to feel conflicted about this because they find Algeria to be their home. They think of it in those terms. Whereas Fanon and certainly Sartre are less sympathetic to the idea that these colonists or these French nationals born in Algeria really sort of belong there. Like, aren't they interlopers whose purpose is really to maintain the system of colonialism? And again, in colonialism as a system, Sartre's argument that the France had to create a market in Algeria, the pied noirs are in part the creation of this market within Algeria that, again, is designed to benefit France while excluding the interests of the so-called native population. Again, we'll see increasingly explicit arguments made about how the term native is a problem, that the native is in a lot of ways a creation of the colonial power, that they didn't think of themselves as natives until the colonies came and instantiated this difference between natives and colonists, between the colonizer and the colonized. And the category of the native emerges out of the perspective of the foreign rule that comes in and says, oh, you all are the natives and we are the colonizer, and so on. So that theme will become very prominent as we move through this set of texts here. Now, Again, the importance of language is discussed leading up to this sort of summary passage. In short, the third world is discovering itself and talking to itself through this voice. We know that it is not homogeneous and that it still finds subjugated peoples there, others who have acquired a false independence, others who are fighting to win sovereignty, and others, finally, who have won total freedom, but who live under a constant threat of imperialist aggression. These differences were born of colonial history, in other words, of oppression. Here, the mother country contented itself with paying a few feudal landowners. There, by dividing and ruling, it has artificially created a bourgeoisie of the colonized. Elsewhere, it has killed two birds with one stone by establishing a colony of exploitation and settlement. Thus, Europe has multiplied the divisions and opposition, forged classes, and sometimes racisms attempted by every means to cause and to increase the stratification of the colonized societies. Fanon hides nothing. To fight against us, the former colony must fight against itself. Or rather, the two are one and the same thing. So again, the colony, by creating all of these divisions, in part creates the tensions that will destroy it. And so to fight against colonialism is to fight against the system, and therefore against the very classes and stratifications that have been imposed by it. So you can't get rid of the system again just by merely redistributing goods and the wealth of the colony within these existing classes. The classes have been established by the colony for the sole purpose of maintaining colonial power, and so those classes and divisions must themselves be destroyed and dismantled, which includes classes like native and so on. We're going to see very interesting arguments to the effect that, in a sense, the native seeks their own destruction as a native, that they wish to enter into this category of humanity, and that means to leave behind their so-called nativeness in a way. So we'll see how that works a little bit more clearly in Fanon, but it's something to sort of keep your eye on, and again feeds into this increasingly dialectic interpretation that Sartre is bringing to bear on the situation. So very interesting. I'm going to leave this particular video off here on that point, and then pick up again with the emphasis on dialectics and the tension that's going to destroy these stratifications in the next video. And I just want to focus on that and wrap up Sartre's preface with a little closer reading of the text, and specifically paying specific attention to the dialectical tension that's generated within the class stratifications of colonialism. And so that will give us a pretty good overall intro to the analysis that follows from existentialist theory now applied to the colonial situation, which again we'll see very clearly in Fanon when we get to Black Skin, White Masks. So thanks for following along with this video so far, and I will see you in the next and concluding video on Sartre's preface to The Wretched of the Earth.